I remember the first time I heard about the old man's disappearance. It was a cold, foggy morning when the news spread like wildfire through our small town. The kind of morning where the mist clings to your skin and the air feels heavy with secrets. I was sitting in the local diner, nursing a cup of coffee, when Mrs. Thompson, the town gossip, burst in, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Old man Jenkins is gone," she announced, her voice trembling. "His grave's been dug up, and he's nowhere to be found." The diner fell silent. Old man Jenkins, the caretaker of the cemetery, had been a fixture in our town for as long as anyone could remember. His disappearance wasn't just a shock, it was a violation of our town's sanctity. The cemetery, with its ancient, moss-covered headstones, was where our history lay buried, literally. And now, someone was disturbing it. I felt a chill, not just from the cold, but from the realization that something sinister was at play. Jenkins wasn't just any old man. He was rumored to have secrets, dark ones from his past that he never shared. And now his absence whispered those secrets back to life, echoing through the town like a warning. The next day, I decided to visit the cemetery myself. The fog hadn't lifted, and the place looked even more eerie in the daylight. The disturbed earth around Jenkins' grave was a stark contrast to the otherwise serene setting. I walked among the tombstones, each one telling a story of lives once lived, now shrouded in mystery. As I wandered, I noticed something odd, a fresh bouquet of flowers on a grave that hadn't seen visitors in years. The name on the headstone was barely legible, but it seemed familiar. I made a mental note to look into it later. Back in town, life seemed to carry on as usual, but there was an undercurrent of unease. At the hardware store, Mr. Carter was unusually quiet, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a furrowed brow. "Morning, Carter," I greeted, trying to sound casual. He nodded, barely looking up from his inventory. "Morning. Heard about Jenkins?" "Yeah. Strange business," I replied, picking up a few nails I didn't need just to have something to do with my hands. "You know anything about it?" Carter shook his head, but his eyes darted away too quickly. "Just that it's not right. Not right at all." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the local newspaper spread out before me. The headlines screamed about Jenkins' disappearance, but there was something else, a small sidebar about another missing person. This time, it was young Sarah, who worked at the post office. Her disappearance was less sensational, but it added to the growing unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that these events were connected, not just by the cemetery, but by something deeper, something rooted in our town's past. I decided then to start my own little investigation, not knowing where it would lead, but driven by a need to understand why our town, so peaceful on the surface, was now a canvas for such dark strokes. The next morning, I met with a few others at the diner who seemed as unsettled as I was. There was Tom, who ran the local library, and Emily, a history teacher with a keen interest in local lore. Over coffee, we began piecing together what we knew, which wasn't much, but it was a start. "Sarah was last seen near the cemetery," Emily mentioned, her voice low. "And she was digging around in some old records at the library just before she vanished," Tom added, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. The gravity of the situation was beginning to weigh on us. We knew we needed to dig deeper, but the more we uncovered, the more we realized how little we truly understood about our town's history. That afternoon, we gathered at the library, where Tom had access to records that weren't available to the public. The musty smell of old paper filled the air as we sifted through yellowed documents and brittle newspapers. "Look at this," Emily said, holding up a faded photograph. It showed a group of men, their faces stern, standing in front of the very cemetery where Jenkins' grave had been disturbed. This was taken in 1923. The caption says they were part of some kind of local society. I peered closer, recognizing the name on one of the tombstones in the background. That's the same grave I saw the flowers on. Tom nodded, pulling out a ledger. And here, look at this. There's a record of a land dispute involving the cemetery. It mentions a secret society, but the details are, well, they're not exactly clear. As we pieced together the fragments of our town's past, a pattern began to emerge. The society, known as the Guardians of the Veil, was not just a social club. They had influence, power, and according to some of the documents, they were involved in darker dealings, abductions, manipulation, and perhaps even murder to keep their secrets buried. The tension was palpable. Each revelation felt like a step closer to danger. We decided to split up to cover more ground. Emily took the historical angle, diving into old diaries and letters. Tom focused on legal documents, looking for any official records of the society. I took on the task of talking to the older residents, those who might remember whispers or rumors from their youth. My first visit was to Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter's elderly mother, who lived in a quaint house on the edge of town. She was reluctant at first, but after some coaxing, she began to speak. "The Guardians," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They were supposed to protect the town, but from what? No one ever said. My husband, he was involved, but he never spoke of it. After he passed, I found this." She handed me a small, tarnished key. He said it was for something important, something hidden. The key was cold in my hand, and its weight felt like a promise of secrets yet to be uncovered. I thanked Mrs. Carter and left, the key burning a hole in my pocket. Back at the library, Emily had found a diary entry from 1947, written by a woman named Eliza, who mentioned her brother's disappearance after he started asking questions about the society. She writes here that he was warned to stop digging, but he didn't listen, and then he was gone. Tom, meanwhile, had unearthed a will that mentioned a hidden vault beneath the cemetery, a place where the society supposedly kept their records and perhaps their darkest secrets. The pieces were coming together, but so was the danger. That night, as I walked home, I felt eyes on me. The shadows seemed to move, and the silence of the night was broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The next day, we planned to meet at the cemetery at dawn, armed with shovels and flashlights, ready to find this vault. But as we approached, we found the gate locked, a new chain and padlock gleaming in the early light. Someone else knew we were getting close. The challenge was clear. We were not just investigators anymore. We were targets. The town's hidden history was fighting back, and we were caught in the crossfire of a battle for truth and secrecy. As we stood there, the cold metal of the key in my pocket, I realized that uncovering the past might just cost us our future. The morning mist was thick, almost suffocating, as we stood at the locked gates of the cemetery. The cold key in my pocket felt like a lead weight, a symbol of the secrets we were about to unlock. Emily, Tom, and I exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of our situation palpable in the silence. "We need to get in there," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the very air was listening. "But how?" I pulled out the key Mrs. Carter had given me, its tarnished surface catching the dim light. "Maybe this is what we need, but we can't do this in broad daylight. We'll come back tonight." The day passed with a heavy sense of foreboding. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer. Every whisper of the wind carried an ominous tone. We met again at dusk, the cemetery looming like a silent sentinel, over our town's darkest secrets. With the cover of darkness, we approached the gate. The lock clicked open with a reluctant groan, as if it was warning us to turn back. We slipped inside, the air growing colder, the silence more profound. Using our flashlights, we navigated through the headstones, their inscriptions a testament to lives long gone, but not forgotten. We reached the area where Jenkins' grave had been disturbed, and there, hidden among the oldest graves, was a stone slab with an inscription that matched the key's design. "This is it," Emily whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. We worked quickly, prying the slab loose, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness. The descent was steep, the air growing musty and stale. Our lights flickered over walls lined with cobwebs and dampness. At the bottom, we found a heavy wooden door, locked with an ancient mechanism that matched the key perfectly. With a deep breath, I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a resistance that seemed to echo through the vault, and the door creaked open, revealing a chamber lit by the dim glow of an old lantern hanging from the ceiling. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books, old photographs, and what looked like personal belongings. In the center of the room stood a large table covered in maps and documents, some of which were stained with what could only be blood. "This is it," Tom murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "The heart of the guardians of the Veil." We moved to the table, our hands trembling as we sifted through the papers. There were records of abductions, lists of names, and cryptic notes about rituals and sacrifices. But it was a photograph that caught my eye. A group of men, including Jenkins, standing around a figure bound and gagged. "That's Sarah," Emily gasped, pointing at the bound figure. "They took her because she was getting too close." The realization hit us like a wave. Jenkins wasn't just a victim. He was part of this. The disappearances, the graves, it was all connected to this secret society that had been manipulating our town for generations. Suddenly, a noise from above made us freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, approached the vault. We turned off our flashlights, plunging into darkness, our hearts pounding in our chests. The door at the top of the stairs opened and light spilled down. A figure descended, his silhouette familiar. It was Mr. Carter, his face stern, his eyes cold. "I knew you'd find this place eventually," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "You've been digging too deep, asking too many questions." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mr. Carter, a man we all knew, a man we trusted, was part of this darkness. The betrayal stung, but there was no time for hurt feelings. "Why, Mr. Carter?" I asked, my voice steadied despite the turmoil inside. He sighed, his gaze shifting to the documents on the table. "To protect the town. Or at least, that's what they told us. The guardians of the Veil were supposed to keep the balance, to ensure that certain secrets stayed buried. But over time, it became about control, about maintaining power over the town. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.